The autumn wind carried dust and the smell of distant snow across the Colorado mountains as Jake Morrison heard the wagon wheels creaking up his dirt road. He set down his axe and wiped the sweat from his forehead, squinting through the golden afternoon light. Nobody ever came up to his cabin unless they were lost or bringing bad news. Jake had lived alone on Copper Ridge for 8 years now. After the war ended and he came back different from the man who'd left, he bought this piece of land with his army pay and built everything with his own 2 hands. The cabin sat sturdy against the mountainside, with a good well, a barn for his 2 horses, and enough cleared land for a garden that kept him fed. He liked the quiet. He liked knowing exactly what each day would bring. The wagon bounced over the ruts he'd never bothered to smooth out, and Jake could see it was Ned Patterson from town driving. Ned ran the general store and handled mail deliveries to the scattered homesteads. But Ned wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting beside him, wearing a blue traveling dress and a bonnet that had seen better days. And in the back of the wagon, Jake could make out 2 small figures. Jake's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten all about the letter he'd written 6 months ago during one of those long winter nights when the silence pressed in too heavy. His sister Martha had been pestering him in her letters about finding a wife, saying a man wasn't meant to live alone like a bear in a cave. After drinking too much whiskey one February night, he'd written to one of those mail-order bride agencies back east. Then, spring came, summer passed, and he'd figured nothing would come of it. The wagon pulled up in front of his cabin, and Ned climbed down with a grin that meant trouble. "Afternoon, Jake," Ned called out, tipping his hat. "Got a delivery for you." The woman climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity, smoothing her skirts. She was probably around 25, with brown hair tucked neatly under her bonnet, and green eyes that took in everything around her without giving away what she thought. She wasn't pretty in the way men wrote songs about, but there was something solid about her, like she'd been tested and come through stronger. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "I'm Sarah Collins. I believe you're expecting me." Before Jake could find his tongue, 2 children scrambled down from the wagon bed. A boy who looked about 8, with sandy hair sticking up in all directions, and a girl maybe 6 years old with the same green eyes as the woman. Both kids looked around with the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that meant they'd ask a million questions before supper. "Now hold on," Jake started, but Sarah Collins held up one gloved hand. "I know this isn't what you were expecting," she said calmly. "The agency letter mentioned I was a widow, but it didn't specify about Tom and Lucy here. I should have been clearer in my correspondence." Tom, the boy, stepped forward with his chin raised like he was ready for a fight. "Our ma's the best cook in Pennsylvania," he announced. "And she can read and write and do some's better than most men." Lucy, the little girl, stayed closer to her mother but watched Jake with those serious green eyes. She was clutching a rag doll that looked like it had traveled many hard miles. Ned was enjoying this whole situation far too much. "Well, Jake, seems like you're getting a family package deal. I'll just unload these trunks and be heading back before dark." Jake's mind was spinning. He'd written for a wife, someone quiet and capable who could cook decent meals and maybe help with the garden. He hadn't bargained for children. He didn't know the first thing about children. The war had taken away his chance for a normal family life, and he'd made peace with being alone. But as he looked at Sarah Collins standing there with her back straight and her children pressed close, he could see the worry she was trying to hide. Her dress was clean but patched in places. Her boots had been resoled more than once. These people had traveled a long way with probably very little money, and if he sent them back now, they'd have nowhere to go. "You all stay put," he heard himself say. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, and Sarah's eyes flashed with something that might have been relief or might have been determination to fight if he tried to send them away. Ned finished unloading 2 worn trunks and a wooden crate, then climbed back onto his wagon with that same infuriating grin. "I'll let folks in town know your bride arrived safely, Jake. Much obliged for the entertainment." As the wagon rolled away, Jake found himself alone with three strangers who were apparently his responsibility now. The silence stretched out until Tom broke it. "You got any horses, mister?" the boy asked. "I'm good with horses." "Two," Jake answered. "In the barn." "Can I see them?" "Tom," Sarah said sharply. "Mind your manners." But Jake was already walking toward the barn, and after a moment, he heard footsteps following. All three of them trailed behind him as he opened the barn doors and let out Copper, his big chestnut gelding, and Belle, the smaller mare he used for trips to town. Tom's eyes lit up as he approached Copper carefully, hand extended for the horse to sniff. The boy had good instincts, Jake noticed. He didn't rush or make sudden moves. "He's beautiful," Tom breathed. "What's his name?" "Copper," Jake said, on account of his color matching the copper veins in the mountain. Lucy had found courage enough to pet Belle's soft nose, and the mare lowered her head gently for the little girl. Sarah stood back, watching her children with a soft expression that made something twist in Jake's chest. "They love animals," Sarah said quietly. "Back in Pennsylvania, we had to sell our horse when—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, that's behind us now." As they walked back to the cabin, Jake tried to see his home through their eyes. The main room held his table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and not much else. There was a small bedroom off to one side where he slept, and a loft space above that he'd never had reason to use. Sarah looked around with a practical eye. "It's a good, solid cabin," she said. "Room to grow." Tom was already climbing the ladder to the loft. "Ma, there's a whole room up here," he called down. "Tom, get down from there this instant," Sarah said, but Jake waved her off. "It's all right. That's where the kids can sleep if they want. I built this place bigger than I needed." Thinking, he stopped himself. No point mentioning dreams that hadn't come true. Sarah was still standing in the middle of his main room, looking uncertain for the first time since she climbed down from Ned's wagon. Lucy had settled on the stone hearth with her doll, but she kept glancing between Jake and her mother like she was trying to figure out if they were safe here. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah began formally. "Jake," he corrected. "Jake," she tried again. "I want to be clear about our arrangement. I came here prepared to be a wife in name and deed to a good man who could provide for my children. I can cook, clean, sew, tend a garden, and help with whatever work you need done. I'm not afraid of hard work, and neither are Tom and Lucy." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But if you find you can't accept all of us, I'll understand. Just give us a few days to rest up and figure out our next step." Jake studied her face, seeing the pride that wouldn't let her beg, and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. These people had risked everything on a chance that a stranger might give them a home. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. Sarah's jaw tightened. "He died in a mine collapse 2 years ago. The company said it was his fault for not following safety rules, so there was no compensation. I tried to make it work, taking in washing and sewing, but it wasn't enough. When the bank threatened to foreclose." She lifted her chin. "I won't let my children go hungry or end up in some orphanage. I'll do whatever honest work it takes to keep us together." Tom had climbed back down from the loft and was standing protectively near his mother. Lucy clutched her doll tighter, but kept watching Jake with those serious eyes. Jake walked to the window and looked out at his land, trying to sort through thoughts that felt as tangled as fishing line. He'd gotten used to his quiet life, his predictable days, his freedom to do exactly what he wanted when he wanted. Taking on a ready-made family would change everything. But as he turned back to look at them, he realized they'd already changed something just by being there. The cabin felt different with voices in it, with the smell of Sarah's lavender soap and the sight of Lucy's doll on his hearth, and Tom's eager face watching every move he made. "You hungry?" he asked finally. Sarah nodded. "We haven't eaten since breakfast. I've got venison stew left from yesterday, and there's bread I traded for in town. It's not fancy cooking." "I'm sure it's fine," Sarah said, but she was already looking around his kitchen area with the expression of a woman who saw room for improvement. As Jake served up bowls of stew and cut thick slices of bread, he found himself watching how Sarah helped Lucy with her food and reminded Tom to use his napkin. They were good kids, he could see that. Polite and well-behaved despite whatever hardships they'd faced. So what made you come all the way out here? Jake asked as they ate. There must have been men looking for wives closer to Pennsylvania. Sarah was quiet for a moment, spooning stew for Lucy. I wanted somewhere my children could grow up safe and free, she said finally. Somewhere they could run and play without breathing coal dust and worry. Your letter mentioned mountains and clear streams and room to breathe. Jake didn't remember writing anything that poetic, but maybe the whiskey had made him more eloquent than usual. It's isolated, he warned. Town's a 2-hour ride, and in winter we might not see another soul for weeks at a time. That doesn't frighten me, Sarah said. We've been alone before. After supper, Sarah insisted on washing the dishes while Jake brought in their trunks. Tom tried to help carry the heavier trunk, struggling with the weight but determined not to ask for assistance. Lucy followed them around like a quiet shadow, still holding tight to her doll. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake found himself sitting on his front porch with 3 people he'd never expected to be responsible for. Sarah had put Lucy to bed in the loft, and Tom was asking endless questions about the mountains and what kind of animals live there. Are there bears? Tom wanted to know. Some, Jake admitted, but they mostly stay higher up in the summer. Come spring, you'll need to be careful around the berry patches. What about Indians? Tom, Sarah warned from the doorway. It's all right, Jake said. They're the Ute band that passes through sometimes, but Chief Running Bear and I have an understanding. They don't bother me, and I don't bother them. Tom's eyes went wide. You know a real Indian chief? I know a man who leads his people and cares about their welfare, just like any good leader would, Jake said carefully. They're not the savages some folks make them out to be. Sarah settled into the second chair Jake had brought outside, smoothing her skirts around her. In the fading light, she looked younger and more vulnerable than she had when she climbed down from Ned's wagon. This is beautiful country, she said quietly. I can see why you chose it. Jake followed her gaze across the valley below, where aspen trees were turning gold and the last light caught on the stream that wound through his property. He'd taken the view for granted after 8 years, but seeing it through her eyes made him notice it again. It's peaceful, he agreed. Most of the time. What do you do when it's not peaceful? Jake thought about the nights when memories of the war came back in dreams, when he'd wake up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. He thought about the winter blizzards that could trap a man in his cabin for days, and the silence so deep it felt like being buried alive. I manage, he said simply. Sarah nodded like she understood more than he'd said. We all learn to manage. Tom had fallen asleep leaning against the porch railing, and Sarah gently shook him awake to send him up to the loft with his sister. When they were alone, she turned to Jake with that direct gaze of hers. I need to know what you're thinking, she said. I can see this isn't what you planned for. Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of his mountain. An owl called from the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. No, he said finally. It's not what I planned for. He saw her flinch slightly, but she kept her composure. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, he continued. I've been alone up here for 8 years, and I'd gotten used to thinking that was how it would always be. Maybe it's time for something different. Sarah's hands were folded tightly in her lap. The children and I come as a package, she said firmly. I won't be separated from them for any man, no matter how good his prospects. I wouldn't ask you to be, Jake said, and meant it. If we're going to try this, we're all in it together. Try this, Sarah repeated. What exactly are we trying? Jake stood up and walked to the porch railing, gripping the wood as he tried to put his thoughts into words. I guess we're trying to see if 4 people who need something can make it work together. You need a home and security for your kids. He paused, realizing he'd never said it out loud before. I need to remember what it feels like to be part of something bigger than just surviving. When he turned back, Sarah was studying his face in the moonlight. That's honest enough, she said softly. We'll take it slow, Jake said. Get to know each other. See how the kids settle in. If it works, We'll make it legal in the spring when the circuit preacher comes through. If it doesn't, he shrugged. We'll figure something out. Sarah stood and smoothed her skirts, and Jake realized she was taller than he'd first thought. Strong and capable like she'd had to be. All right then, she said. We'll try. As she moved toward the door, Jake caught her arm gently. Sarah? She turned back to him, eyebrows raised. Thank you, he said, for being brave enough to come all this way. For trusting a stranger with your children's future. That couldn't have been easy. Something soft crossed her expression. Thank you for saying we could stay put, she replied. I was terrified you'd send us away. After she'd gone inside, Jake stayed on the porch for another hour, trying to wrap his mind around how completely his life had changed in the space of a single afternoon. This morning, he'd been a confirmed bachelor with no responsibilities beyond feeding his horses and chopping enough wood for winter. Now he had a woman and 2 children sleeping in his loft, and the knowledge that come tomorrow, everything would be different. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he listened to the quiet sound of a family settling in for the night, Jake found himself looking forward to morning for the first time in years. Jake woke before dawn to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, wondering if he'd dreamed the whole thing. Then he heard Tom's voice asking something about pancakes, and Sarah's quiet response, and he knew yesterday had been real. He dressed quickly and stepped into the main room to find Sarah already busy at his stove, wearing a practical brown dress and an apron she must have brought in her trunk. Tom and Lucy sat at his table, hair combed neat and faces washed, looking more settled than they had the night before. Morning, Sarah said without turning around. I hope you don't mind. I found your supplies and took the liberty of making a proper breakfast. Jake's usual breakfast consisted of coffee and whatever leftover bread he had lying around. The smell filling his cabin was making his stomach growl in a way it hadn't done since he'd eaten at the hotel in town 6 months ago. Smells good, he said, settling into his chair. Lucy gave him a shy smile, and Tom bounced a little in his seat. Mom makes the best pancakes in 3 counties, Tom announced proudly. Maybe 4. Tom Morrison, don't you go bragging, Sarah chided, but Jake caught the pleased flush in her cheeks at her son's praise. She set down a platter of golden pancakes, crispy bacon, and scrambled eggs that looked fluffier than any Jake had ever managed to make himself. When she poured his coffee, he noticed her hands were steady and, sure, no nervous fidgeting like some women might have on their first morning in a strange man's house. This is... Jake took a bite of pancake and had a pause. This is the best meal I've had in 8 years. Just good fresh eggs and real butter, Sarah said, settling into her own chair. Though I notice your pantry could use some work. When was the last time you had vegetables that didn't come from a can? Jake tried to remember. I grow some things in summer. Potatoes, beans, squash. What about preserving for winter? Canning, drying, root storage. The way she asked made Jake realize how poorly he'd been taking care of himself. He got him by on the basics, but Sarah was talking about actually eating well, not just surviving. Never learned much about preserving, he admitted. Sarah nodded like she'd expected as much. Well, it's not too late in the season. If you can spare some time today, we could ride to town and see what's still available at the general store. Apples, late vegetables, maybe some sugar for canning. You want to go to town already? Jake asked, surprised. People are going to be curious about us, Sarah said practically. Better they meet us sooner than later, before the gossip gets too wild. And Tom and Lucy need to know where town is, in case there's ever an emergency. She was right, Jake realized. Word of his mail-order bride, and her children would already be spreading through the valley, thanks to Ned Patterson's big mouth. Better to face the curiosity head-on than hide up here like he had something to be ashamed of. After breakfast, Jake hitched up his wagon while Sarah packed a basket with sandwiches and dressed the children in their good clothes. Lucy wore a blue dress with tiny flowers on it that made her green eyes look even bigger, and Tom had slicked down his sandy hair with water until it lay flat. The ride to town took them through some of Jake's favorite country, winding along the creek that ran through the valley and past stands of aspen trees that glowed like gold coins in the morning sun. Tom peppered him with questions about every bird they saw and every rock formation they passed. Lucy was quieter, but Jake noticed she was watching everything with those serious eyes, like she was filing it all away for later. Sarah sat beside him on the wagon seat, pointing out things to the children, but mostly just taking in the scenery. She'd worn her better traveling dress, the blue one from yesterday, and had pinned her brown hair up neat under a small hat. "It's beautiful country," she said as they rounded a bend that gave them a view across the entire valley. "I can see why you chose it." "It chose me more, like Jake said. I was heading west after the war. Didn't much care where I ended up. Then I saw this valley, and something about it felt right." "Like home," Sarah said softly. "Yeah, like home." The town of Cedar Falls sat at the wide part of the valley where two streams came together. It wasn't much to look at, a main street with maybe 15 buildings, including the general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a few other shops. But it served the scattered ranches and homesteads for 20 miles around, and Jake had always found it friendly enough. Today, though, he could feel eyes on them from the moment they drove down Main Street. Mrs. Henderson came out of the dress shop to sweep her already clean porch. Old Pete stopped whittling in front of the saloon to stare. By the time Jake pulled up in front of Patterson's general store, they had drawn quite an audience. Ned Patterson came out with that same grin from yesterday, wiping his hands on his apron. Well, if it isn't the Morrison family," he called out cheerfully. "How'd everyone sleep last night?" "Fine, thank you," Sarah said with dignity as Jake helped her down from the wagon. She kept one hand on Lucy's shoulder and directed Tom to stay close. More people were gathering now. Jake recognized most of them. Ranch hands from the bar T, Mrs. Miller who ran the boarding house, Doc Hartley who served as the town's only medical authority. They were all trying to look casual while obviously studying every detail of Jake's new family. "Folks," Jake said with a nod, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Sarah, and her children, Tom and Lucy." A murmur went through the small crowd. Mrs. Miller stepped forward with a smile that looked genuine. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Mrs. Morrison," she said warmly. "I'm Ruth Miller. If you need anything while you're settling in, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "That's very kind." Doc Hartley tipped his hat. "Ma'am, children, if you ever need medical attention, my office is above the barber shop. Though I hope you'll stay healthy as horses up there on the mountain." Tom piped up unexpectedly. "Are you a real doctor? With medicines and everything?" Doc Hartley chuckled. "Real as they come, son. Studied in St. Louis before I came out here to patch up cowboys and miners." "Tom's always been curious about medicine," Sarah explained. "He reads everything he can get his hands on. Smart boy," Doc said approvingly. "I might have some medical books you could borrow, if your parents don't mind." Jake found himself nodding. That'd be fine. As they moved into the general store, more introductions were made. The blacksmith, Jim Foster, shook Jake's hand and welcomed Sarah with gruff kindness. The saloon keeper, surprisingly, turned out to be a woman named Big Mary who stood nearly 6 feet tall and had arms like a lumberjack. "You need anything, honey, you just holler," Big Mary told Sarah. "I know what it's like being the only woman for miles around. Gets lonely sometimes." "I imagine it does," Sarah agreed politely, though Jake noticed she didn't commit to any future visits to the saloon. Inside Patterson's store, Sarah moved efficiently through the aisles, selecting supplies with the practiced eye of a woman who'd learned to make every penny count. She picked up canning jars, sugar, spices, and several bolts of practical fabric. "Planning to do some sewing?" Ned asked. "The children are growing, and winter's coming," Sarah said. "They'll need warmer clothes." She was also studying the shelves of canned goods and dry goods, clearly making mental notes about prices and quality. Jake found himself seeing his familiar trading post through her eyes and realizing how limited the selection was compared to what she must have been used to back east. Tom had discovered a corner of the store where Ned kept books and magazines and was reading titles with excitement. Lucy stayed close to her mother, but kept peeking at the candy jars on the counter. Would it be all right if they each picked out one piece of candy? Sarah asked Jake quietly. The fact that she asked his permission, treating him like the children's father figure, hit Jake unexpectedly. He found himself nodding and pulling out coins for Ned. Pick whatever you like, he told Tom and Lucy. Tom selected a peppermint stick with serious consideration, but Lucy seemed overwhelmed by the choices. Finally, Sarah bent down and whispered something in her daughter's ear, and Lucy pointed shyly at a small wrapped caramel. As Jake paid for their purchases, he overheard Sarah talking with Mrs. Miller about the best methods for preserving late-season vegetables. The two women seemed to be hitting it off, discussing recipes and household management with the easy camaraderie of experienced homemakers. Your wife seems like a capable woman, Ned commented as he tallied up the bill. She is, Jake agreed, realizing it was true. In just one day, Sarah had already shown herself to be organized, practical, and good with people. She was handling the curious stares and personal questions from the townspeople with grace and dignity. Outside the store, they loaded their supplies into the wagon. Jake was helping Sarah up to the seat when a woman's voice called out sharply, "Jacob Morrison, is that you?" Jake turned to see Millicent Foster, the blacksmith's wife, bearing down on them with the determined expression of a woman on a mission. Mrs. Foster was known throughout the valley for her strong opinions and stronger voice when it came to expressing them. "Mrs. Foster," Jake said carefully. Millicent Foster looked Sarah up and down with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the mail-order bride we've been hearing about. And with children too, I see." There was something in her tone that made Jake's jaw tighten, but Sarah answered calmly. "I'm Sarah Morrison," she said. "These are my children, Tom and Lucy. Children from a previous marriage, I assume," Mrs. Foster said with the kind of sniff that suggested such things were slightly scandalous. "My husband died in a mining accident," Sarah replied evenly. Mrs. Foster's expression softened slightly. "Oh, well, that's different then. Still, it's quite irregular, a man taking on another man's children. Not that there's anything wrong with it, of course," she added quickly. Jake felt his temper starting to rise, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We're very grateful for Jake's kindness," she said with perfect composure. "And we're looking forward to making a home here." "Yes, well," Mrs. Foster said, clearly unsure how to respond to Sarah's unruffled dignity. "I'm sure you'll find Cedar Falls a good place to raise children. Very moral community." "I'm sure we will," Sarah agreed pleasantly. As they drove out of town, Jake found himself glancing at Sarah with new respect. She'd handled Mrs. Foster's nosiness and subtle criticism without losing her temper or dignity, something Jake wasn't sure he could have managed. "That woman's always had more opinions than sense," he said finally. "There's one in every town," Sarah replied mildly. "The trick is not to let them see they've gotten under your skin." Tom was examining his peppermint stick like it was a precious gem, while Lucy had already finished half her caramel. Both children seemed to have enjoyed their first visit to town, despite the curious stares and whispered comments. "Did we do all right?" Sarah asked as they headed back up the mountain road. "Meeting everyone, I mean." Jake considered the question. The townspeople had been curious, but generally welcoming. Sarah had made a good impression with her quiet dignity and practical manner. Even Mrs. Foster's nosiness hadn't been able to ruffle her composure. "You did fine," he said. "Better than fine. They like you, even the ones who think it's scandalous for you to take on ready-made children." Jake glanced at her, surprised she'd picked up on the subtle undercurrents he'd noticed. "Even them. You handled Mrs. Foster perfectly." Sarah smiled for the first time that day, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "I had plenty of practice back in Pennsylvania. Small towns are the same everywhere." When they reached the cabin, Jake unloaded their supplies while Sarah organized everything with the same efficient competence she'd shown all day. She had Tom help carry the lighter items and gave Lucy the important job of arranging the new books Doc Hartley had sent along. "Can we see the horses again?" Tom asked once everything was put away. "If Jake doesn't mind," Sarah said, looking to him for permission. Jake found himself nodding. "Come on then. Belle probably thinks she's been forgotten." In the barn, Tom immediately went to Copper, while Lucy approached Belle more cautiously. Both horses seemed to remember the children from yesterday, and whinnied soft greetings. "Could I maybe learn to ride?" Tom asked hopefully. "Maybe," Jake said, "if your mother thinks you're ready." He looked at Sarah, who was watching her son with Copper. The boy had good instincts with animals, patient and respectful without being fearful. "He's always loved horses," Sarah said. Back home, he used to help at the stable when he could, learning how to brush them and clean their hooves. "I could teach him the basics," Jake offered. "Both of them, if Lucy wants to learn." Lucy looked up from petting Belle with interest. "Could I really learn to ride?" "Don't see why not," Jake said. "Belle's gentle as a lamb, and you're not afraid of her." As they walked back to the cabin, Tom chattering excitedly about horses and Lucy asking serious questions about how long it took to learn to ride properly, Jake realized something had shifted during their day in town. They felt more like a family now, less like strangers trying to figure each other out. That evening, as Sarah cooked another meal that made Jake's cabin smell like a real home, he found himself watching the easy way she moved around his kitchen, how she automatically included the children in small tasks, how she seemed to fit into the space like she'd always been there. "Sarah," he said as she set a platter of fried chicken on the table. "Yes. Today went well. Better than I expected." She paused in serving Lucy. "I'm glad. I was worried the children might be too much, meeting all those new people." "They were perfect," Jake said, and meant it. "You all were." After supper, as had quickly become their routine, they sat on the porch while the children played in the yard. Tom was building something elaborate with sticks and stones, while Lucy had discovered that Jake's old hound dog, Rex, who usually stayed to himself, was willing to let her pet him if she was very gentle. "They're good kids," Jake said, watching Lucy carefully stroke Rex's graying fur. "They've had to grow up fast," Sarah said quietly. "After their father died, there wasn't much choice." "Tell me about him. Your husband." Sarah was quiet for so long Jake thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "David was a good man. Worked hard, loved his children, tried to provide for us. But he took risks in the mines, always volunteering for the dangerous jobs because they paid better. I begged him to be more careful, but..." She shrugged helplessly. "He said he wanted to save enough money to buy us a little farm somewhere, get out of the coal dust and company housing. He died trying to give us something better." Jake heard the guilt in her voice, the burden of wondering if things might have been different if she'd tried harder to stop her husband from taking those risks. "Sounds like he was trying to be a good provider," Jake said carefully. "He was. But sometimes I think..." Sarah stopped herself. "What?" "Sometimes I think being a good provider means staying alive for your family, not just making money for them." It was a harsh judgment, but Jake could hear the pain behind it. She'd loved her husband, but she'd also lived with the consequences of his choices. "For what it's worth," Jake said, "I think you made the right choice coming here. Takes courage to start over somewhere new." "Does it?" "Sometimes I think it was just desperation." Jake watched Tom showing Lucy how to stack stones, both children absorbed in their play. Maybe it was both. Courage and desperation sometimes look a lot alike. As the stars came out over the mountain, Jake found himself thinking about second chances. He'd come here 8 years ago to escape his own ghosts, and now Sarah and her children had come seeking refuge from theirs. Maybe that was what families really were, people who'd been broken in different ways learning to heal together. "Jake," Sarah's voice was soft in the darkness. "Thank you for today, for letting us stay, for being patient with all of this." "Thank you for taking the risk," he replied. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have people to care about." Neither of them said anything more, but as they sat in comfortable silence watching the children play, Jake felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since the war, he was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 weeks into October, the first real cold snap hit the mountain. Jake woke to frost covering the windows and his breath visible in the cabin air. When he stepped outside to check on the horses, the grass crunched under his boots, and the stream had ice along its edges. Inside, he found Sarah already up, feeding split logs into the fireplace and setting water to heat for coffee. She was wearing a thick shawl over her dress and moved quietly to avoid waking the children. "Cold one," Jake said, rubbing his hands together. "Winter's coming early this year," Sarah agreed. "Tom's already asking about snow. He's never seen a real mountain winter." "He'll see plenty before spring," Jake said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "This is nothing compared to what's coming." Over the past 3 weeks, they'd settled into routines that felt natural as breathing. Sarah had taken over the cooking and most of the household tasks, transforming Jake's bachelor quarters into something that felt like a real home. She'd sewn new curtains for the windows, organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies, and somehow managed to make the cabin feel twice as large despite adding 3 people to it. The children had adapted to mountain life with the resilience of youth. Tom spent his mornings helping Jake with chores and his afternoons exploring the woods around the cabin, always under strict instructions not to wander too far. Lucy had attached herself to Sarah's side most days, learning to cook and sew and tend a vegetable garden Sarah had expanded. But it was the evenings Jake had come to treasure most. After supper, Sarah would read to the children from the small collection of books she'd brought, or Tom would practice his letters while Lucy worked on a sampler Sarah was teaching her to embroider. Jake found himself lingering at the table instead of escaping to the porch, drawn into their quiet domestic routines in ways he'd never expected. This morning, though, he could see worry in Sarah's eyes as she looked out at the frost. "What's troubling you?" he asked. Sarah glanced toward the loft where the children still slept. "Their winter clothes," she said quietly. "What they brought from Pennsylvania won't be warm enough for this climate. And I don't have enough wool to make what they'll need." Jake hadn't thought about that. His own winter gear had been accumulated over 8 years of mountain living, and he'd never had to outfit children for high country cold. "There's a trading post about 2 hours north of here," he said. "Fellow named McLeod runs it. He deals with trappers and mountain men, so he might have what we need." "Can we afford it?" Sarah asked practically. Jake realized she had no idea what his financial situation was. They'd never discussed money, beyond his paying for their supplies in town. "I do all right," he said. "Sell timber to the mine in spring, trade furs I trap in winter, and I've got some money saved for my army pay." Sarah nodded, but he could see she was still calculating costs in her head, the way women did when they'd learned to stretch every penny. "We'll go today," Jake decided, "before the weather turns worse." An hour later, they were loaded into the wagon with the children bundled in every blanket Sarah could spare. The road to McLeod's trading post wound higher into the mountains, following old deer trails and creek beds. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and colder, and patches of snow appeared in the shadows where the sun couldn't reach. Tom was fascinated by everything, pointing out animal tracks in the soft earth, and asking Jake to identify the different types of pine trees they passed. Lucy huddled closer to Sarah, but kept her eyes wide open, taking in the wild country with the same serious attention she gave everything else. "It's so big," she whispered at one point, looking out across a valley that stretched for miles between snow-capped peaks. "Does it scare you?" Sarah asked gently. Lucy considered this with the solemnity of a 6-year-old philosopher. "A little, but it's beautiful scary, not bad scary." Jake found himself smiling at that distinction. The child had put words to something he'd felt but never been able to express about the mountain country. McLeod's trading post sat in a clearing beside a fast-running stream, a log building with smoke rising from its chimney and several smaller outbuildings scattered around it. As they pulled up, Jake could see the proprietor himself splitting firewood behind the main building. Duncan McLeod was a Scotsman who'd come west during the fur trade boom and stayed when the beaver were trapped out. He was built like a barrel, with arms that could swing an axe all day and a beard that reached halfway down his chest. Despite his fearsome appearance, Jake had always found him to be honest in his dealings and fair in his prices. "Jake Morrison," McLeod called out, setting down his axe. "What brings you up to my neck of the woods?" "Family business," Jake said, helping Sarah down from the wagon. "Duncan McLeod, meet my wife Sarah and her children, Tom and Lucy." McLeod's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Wife. Well, I'll be. When did this happen? 3 weeks ago, Jake said simply. McLeod studied Sarah with the frank appraisal of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly in the wilderness. Whatever he saw must have pleased him, because he broke into a wide grin. Welcome to the high country, Mrs. Morrison, he said with a slight bow. And these fine children, too. Come in. I've got coffee on the stove, and my woman's got fresh biscuits in the oven. Jake had never met McLeod's woman before, though he'd heard mention of her. She turned out to be a quiet Ute woman named Singing Bird who welcomed them with shy smiles and fresh coffee that was even stronger than Jake's usual brew. The trading post was crammed with everything a mountain dweller might need: tools, weapons, traps, blankets, and clothes made from every kind of hide and fur imaginable. McLeod dealt primarily with trappers and hunters, men who needed gear that would keep them alive in the harshest conditions. Winter clothes for the little ones, is it? McLeod asked when Jake explained their needs. Well, you've come to the right place. He led them to a corner of the store where children's clothing was displayed. There were wool coats lined with rabbit fur, thick boots made from buffalo hide, mittens lined with sheep's wool, and caps that would cover everything but the children's eyes. Tom's eyes went wide as he tried on a coat that made him look like a small bear. Lucy giggled when McLeod fitted her with a fur cap that was almost too big for her head. These will keep them warm down to 40 below, McLeod assured Sarah. My own young ones were the same, and they play outside in weather that would freeze a brass monkey. Sarah was examining the quality of the stitching and the thickness of the materials with a practiced eye. They're beautifully made, she said, but they must be expensive. For Jake Morrison's family? I think we can work something out, McLeod said with a wink. As the two men negotiated prices, Tom discovered a collection of books in another corner of the store. They were an odd assortment, volumes on natural history, adventure novels, and technical manuals that had probably belonged to various trappers and traders over the years. Can I look at these? Tom asked politely. Course you can, lad, McLeod said. You can read, can you? Yes, sir. Without me. Smart woman. Education's worth more than gold in this country. Lucy had found Singing Bird's basket of sewing supplies and was watching with fascination as the Ute woman worked on a pair of moccasins decorated with intricate beadwork. Pretty, Lucy said softly. Singing Bird smiled and said something in her own language, then switched to careful English. You like to learn? Lucy nodded eagerly, and soon she was sitting beside Singing Bird, learning to thread beads on sinew under the older woman's patient guidance. Your children are well behaved, McLeod commented to Sarah as they watched Tom carefully turning pages of a book about Rocky Mountain wildlife. Not often I see young ones who know how to mind their manners. They've had to learn, Sarah said simply. McLeod nodded understanding. Life in the wilderness didn't allow for spoiled or unruly children, and he'd clearly recognized that these two had been taught to conduct themselves properly. When their business was concluded, the children were outfitted with warm coats, boots, mittens, and hats that would see them through the harshest weather. McLeod had also let Tom select 2 books from his collection, and Singing Bird had given Lucy a small pouch of colorful beads with instructions to practice what she'd learned. You folks are welcome anytime, McLeod said as they prepared to leave. And if the weather turns bad before you can make it to town, remember we're here. Always room for friends at our table. The ride back to the cabin was quieter than the trip up, with both children drowsy from the mountain air and the excitement of new clothes and presents. Sarah sat close beside Jake on the wagon seat, and he found himself very aware of her warmth and the way she smelled faintly of the lavender soap she used. That was kind of him to give us such good prices, Sarah said as they wound down through the mountains. Duncan's good people, Jake agreed. Him and Singing Bird have helped more than one family get through hard times. How long have they been together? 7, 8 years maybe. He found her during a bad winter, half frozen after her band was attacked by raiders. Nursed her back to health, and she just never left. And people accept that? A white man with an Indian wife. Jake considered the question. Up here, people mostly care whether you can be depended on in a crisis. Duncan and Singing Bird have proved themselves useful neighbors more times than I can count. Most folks don't worry about the rest. Sarah was quiet for a moment. It must be nice to live somewhere that practical considerations matter more than social conventions. Is that why you came west? To get away from social conventions? Partly, Sarah admitted. After David died, there were certain expectations about how a widow should behave. What kind of work was appropriate, who I should associate with, how long I should mourn before even thinking about another husband. I got tired of living my life according to other people's rules. Jake understood that feeling. The war had taught him that society's rules often had little to do with what actually mattered when life got difficult. Back at the cabin, they spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for winter in earnest. Sarah and Lucy worked on organizing the new clothes while Jake and Tom checked the firewood supply and made sure the barn was ready for the hard weather ahead. "How much snow will there be?" Tom asked as they stacked split logs. "Depends on the winter," Jake said. "Some years, just a few feet. Bad years, it can pile up to the cabin windows. We might not see bare ground again until May." Tom's eyes lit up with excitement rather than concern. "Will we be snowed in?" "For weeks at a time, sometimes. That's why we have to make sure we have enough food and firewood stored up. And then it's just us? No one else for miles." "Just us," Jay confirmed. The idea didn't seem to frighten Tom at all. If anything, the prospect of being completely isolated with his new family seemed to appeal to him. That evening, as they settled into their usual after-supper routine, Jake found himself thinking about McLeod's words about well-behaved children. Tom and Lucy had adapted to their new life with remarkable grace, accepting Jake's authority without question and following Sarah's lead in treating him like the head of their household. But it was more than just good manners. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd watched both children gradually relax in ways that suggested they hadn't felt truly safe in a long time. Tom's endless questions and Lucy's quiet observation were signs of children who felt secure enough to be curious about their world again. "Jake," Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. I've been thinking about winter preparations. Do you usually lay in much in the way of medical supplies?" Jake realized he'd never given much thought to medical emergencies. If he got hurt or sick, he either tough it out or try to make it to Doc Hartley in town. "Not really." "Why?" With children in the house and the possibility of being snowed in for weeks, it would be wise to have some basic medicines on hand. Fever powders, liniment for muscle strains, something for stomach troubles. She was right, of course. His bachelor approach to medical care wouldn't work with a family to think about. "Make a list," he said. "We'll pick up supplies next time we go to town." Sarah nodded and went back to her mending, but Jake could see she was still thinking about something. "What else is worrying you?" he asked. "Winter's going to be a test," she said quietly, glancing toward the loft where the children had already gone to bed. "Being cooped up together for months, no outside distractions. We're still getting to know each other, and close quarters can strain even established families." Jake hadn't thought about that either, but he could see her point. It was one thing to be polite and accommodating when people could escape to their own space or find other activities. It was another thing entirely to live in each other's pockets for months at a time. "Are you worried we won't get along?" he asked. Sarah set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "I'm worried about a lot of things. Whether the children will get restless and drive you to distraction. Whether you'll regret taking us on when you're stuck with us 24 hours a day. Whether we'll all end up sick of each other by spring." Her honesty was typical of the straightforward way she approached everything, but Jake could hear real anxiety behind the practical concerns. "Sarah," he said carefully, "do you want to be here?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Of course I do. This is the first real home Tom and Lucy have had since their father died. And you've been kinder to us than I had any right to expect." "That's not what I asked," Jake said. "I asked if you want to be here. Not whether you're grateful, or whether it's practical, or whether it's best for the children. Do you want to be here?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands still on her sewing. When she looked up, there was something vulnerable in her green eyes that he hadn't seen before. I'm trying to want it, she said honestly. I respect you, and I think you're a good man. I can see us building a good life together. But wanting, she shrugged helplessly. I'm not sure I remember how to want things for myself anymore. Jake understood that more than she might have expected. The war had taught him to focus on survival rather than desire, on getting through each day rather than hoping for happiness. Maybe that's enough for now, he said gently. Maybe wanting comes later, after trust. Sarah's smile was soft and grateful. Maybe it does. As they prepared for bed that night, Jake found himself thinking about the long winter ahead. Sarah was right that it would be a test of their ability to live as a family. But watching her bank the fire for the night and listening to the quiet sounds of the children settling down in the loft, he realized he was looking forward to that test. For the first time in 8 years, the prospect of being snowed in didn't feel like a sentence to endure. It felt like an opportunity to build something real with these 3 people who'd somehow become his responsibility and his hope all at the same time. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday morning in early November, roaring down from the high peaks with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Jake woke to the sound of wind howling like a living thing and snow pelting against the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown at the glass. When he peered outside, he couldn't see past the porch. The world had disappeared into a wall of white that swirled and shifted like something alive. This wasn't just a snowstorm. This was the kind of blizzard that could bury a man alive if he was foolish enough to venture out in it. "Dear Lord," Sarah breathed, standing beside him at the window. "I've never seen anything like this." Tom pressed his nose to the glass, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "How deep do you think it'll get, Jake?" "Hard to say," Jake replied, though privately he was estimating at least 3 feet by the time the storm blew itself out. "Could be we're going to be inside for a while." Lucy appeared at Sarah's side, clutching her rag doll and looking uncertain. The sound of the wind was unlike anything they'd experienced in Pennsylvania, where winter storms were tame affairs compared to mountain blizzards. "It's all right, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, pulling her daughter close. "We're safe and warm inside." And they were, Jake realized with satisfaction. Over the past month, they prepared well. The cabin was snug and weatherproof, with enough firewood stacked inside to last for days, and food stores that could keep them fed for weeks if necessary. The horses were secure in the barn with hay and grain, and Jake had made sure all the gaps in the walls were chinked tight against the cold. What he hadn't prepared for was how different the cabin would feel with 4 people confined inside it for what might be days at a time. By the second day of the storm, with the wind still howling and snow piling up against the windows, Tom was growing restless. He'd read both of his new books twice and completed every lesson Sarah could devise for him. Now, he was pacing the cabin like a caged wolf, full of 8-year-old energy with nowhere to spend it. "Can I go outside just for a minute?" he pleaded for the 10th time that morning. "Just to see how deep the snow is." "No," Jake and Sarah said in unison, which had become their standard response. "But I could stay right by the door." "Tom Morrison, if I have to tell you one more time," Sarah began, her patience clearly wearing thin. Jake could see the beginnings of a family crisis brewing. Sarah was trying to keep both children occupied in a space that felt smaller every hour, while managing cooking and cleaning under conditions that were far from ideal. Tom was bouncing off the walls with unused energy, and Lucy was picking up on the tension and becoming increasingly clingy. "Tell you what," Jake said, interrupting the latest argument about outdoor exploration. "Why don't I teach you both a game my grandfather taught me when I was stuck inside during winter storms?" Tom and Lucy looked at him with interest, and even Sarah paused in her bread-making to listen. "It's called Cherokee marbles," Jake continued, pulling a leather pouch from his belongings. "Played with painted stones instead of glass marbles. Good for teaching patience and steady hands." He dumped a collection of smooth river stones onto the table, each one painted with different colors and patterns. Tom immediately reached for them, fascinated by the intricate designs. "Who painted these?" he asked. "My grandmother," Jake said. She was part Cherokee, taught me all the old games when I was about your age. Sarah looked surprised. I didn't know you had Indian blood. Quarter Cherokee on my mother's side. Not something most people talk about back east, but out here it doesn't matter much. He spent the next hour teaching the children the complex rules of Cherokee marbles, which involve skill, strategy, and enough luck to keep things interesting. Tom picked up the game quickly, his competitive nature emerging as he tried to master the finger technique for shooting the stones. Lucy was more cautious, but proved to have an excellent eye for angles and trajectories. Your turn, Ma, Tom said when they played several rounds. Sarah wiped her floury hands on her apron and joined them at the table. Jake watched as she studied the game setup with the same careful attention she applied to everything else, then made her first shot with beginner's luck that sent Tom's favorite stone spinning across the floor. That's not fair, Tom protested, but he was grinning. Life's not fair, young man, Sarah replied primly, though Jake caught the satisfied smile she was trying to hide. The game became their salvation over the next 3 days as the storm raged on. They played tournament-style matches with elaborate scoring systems that Tom devised and Lucy carefully tracked on a piece of slate. Jake found himself looking forward to the games almost as much as the children did, rediscovering the simple pleasure of friendly competition. But it was the conversations that developed around the games that Jake valued most. As they played, stories emerged naturally. Sarah told them about her childhood in a small Pennsylvania town, how she'd met David at a church social, and the early days of their marriage when they'd been young and hopeful about the future. Tom shared memories of his father that revealed a man who'd worked hard but also made time for his children. He told them about learning to fish in the creek behind their company house, and how his father had been teaching him to whittle before the mine accident. Lucy, who rarely spoke about the past, began to open up as well. She remembered her father singing to her at bedtime, and how he'd carve her rag doll from a piece of soft pine wood before buying the cloth body at the company store. Jake found himself sharing stories too, things he hadn't talked about in years. He told them about his grandmother's teaching, about growing up on a small farm in Missouri before the war changed everything. He even found himself talking about some of the better memories from his Army service, the camaraderie among the men, and the satisfaction of a job well done. What he didn't talk about were the darker memories, the things that still sometimes woke him in the night. But as he watched Sarah's face while he spoke, he had the feeling she understood there were parts of his past he wasn't ready to share yet. By the 4th day, the wind had finally died down, though snow was still falling steadily. Jake was able to dig his way to the barn to check on the horses, who were restless but unharmed. The snow was nearly 4 feet deep in the places where it had drifted, and the world outside looked like an alien landscape of white hills and valleys. When will we be able to get out? Sarah asked, standing in the doorway as Jake stomped snow off his boots. Few more days, probably, Jake said. Need to let it settle some, and I'll have to dig paths to the barn and the woodshed. He could see the worry in her eyes, though she was trying to hide it from the children. What's troubling you? He asked quietly. We're lower on some supplies than I'd like, she admitted. And I'm worried about the children getting truly stir-crazy if this goes on much longer. Jake looked around the cabin, trying to see it through her eyes. It was clean and comfortable, but small for 4 people who'd been confined together for days. Tom was already showing signs of frustrated energy, and even Lucy seemed more restless than usual. Tell you what, Jake said. Tomorrow, if the snow stops, I'll dig us out enough to get to the barn. Tom can help me take care of the horses, and maybe we can build a snow fort or something for both kids to work off some energy. Sarah's relief was visible. That would be wonderful. Tom especially needs to burn off some of that restlessness. That evening, as they settled into their usual routines, Jake noticed something had changed in the dynamics of their makeshift family. The forced intimacy of being snowed in together had broken down some of the polite barriers they'd maintained during their first weeks together. They were more comfortable with each other, less careful about maintaining perfect behavior. Tom was sprawled on the floor near the fireplace, reading by the light of the flames. Lucy was curled up next to Sarah on the bench, working on a simple embroidery project with tiny, concentrated stitches. Sarah was mending one of Jake's shirts, her hands moving efficiently in the lamplight. It was a scene of domestic contentment that Jake had never expected to have in his life. The storm still raged outside, but inside their cabin, they were warm and safe and together. The word together resonated in Jake's mind as he watched his unexpected family going about their evening activities. "Sarah," he said impulsively. She looked up from her mending, eyebrows raised in question. "I want you to know that I don't regret this. Any of it, even being cooped up together for days at a time." A soft smile crossed her face. Even when Tom asked if he could go outside for the 100th time today, even then, Jake confirmed, "It's good to have voices in the house. Good to have people to worry about besides myself. And it's good to have someone to depend on," Sarah said quietly. "Someone who knows how to handle whatever comes along." Tom looked up from his book. "Are we really going to build a snow fort tomorrow?" "If the weather cooperates," Jake promised. "Can it have turrets? And maybe a wall around the whole thing? We'll see what we can manage." Lucy abandoned her embroidery to join the conversation. "Could we build a snow horse, too? For the fort to guard?" "A snow horse?" Jake asked, amused. "Like Belle, but made of snow, with a mane and everything." Sarah laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I think your imagination might be bigger than our engineering skills, sweetheart." "We could try," Jake said, earning a delighted giggle from Lucy. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet and the storm continued its assault on the mountain, Jake lay in his bed listening to the sounds of his family sleeping. Sarah's steady breathing from the small alcove she'd claimed as her own space, the children's softer sound from the loft above. The blizzard had tested them in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not just their preparedness or their supplies, but their ability to live as a unit under pressure. And they'd passed that test, he realized. They'd not only survived being confined together for days, but they'd actually grown closer in the process. When he'd written that letter to the mail-order bride agency 8 months ago, he'd been thinking about practical considerations. Someone to cook and clean and maybe provide companionship during the long winter evenings. He'd never imagined he'd end up with a family that felt this real, this right. As sleep finally claimed him, Jake's last conscious thought was gratitude for the storm that had forced them all to discover they could depend on each other when it mattered most. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, with crystalline air that hurt to breathe and snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the sunlight. Jake began the laborious process of digging them out, creating paths to the necessary outbuildings and clearing space around the cabin. Tom proved to be an enthusiastic helper, though his small size limited how much actual digging he could do. What he lacked in strength, he made up for in determination, attacking the snow with the focused intensity of a boy who'd been cooped up too long. True to his promise, Jake helped the children build an elaborate snow fort complete with walls, passages, and what Tom generously called turrets but looked more like lumpy snow towers. Lucy's snow horse never quite achieved the realistic proportions she'd envisioned, but it had definite equine characteristics and a flowing mane made from pine branches. Sarah spent the day cooking a celebration meal to mark their liberation from cabin fever, and that evening they feasted on venison stew, fresh bread, and the last of the preserved peaches from their town supplies. "We did good," Tom announced as they sat around the table, faces flushed from their day in the snow. "We did well," Sarah corrected automatically, but she was smiling as she said it. "We did well," Tom agreed cheerfully. "All of us together." Jake looked around the table at these three people who'd somehow become his family, and realized Tom was right. They had done well, all of them together. The storm had been a test, and they'd not just survived it, but emerged stronger for the experience. Outside, the mountain winter stretched ahead with the promise of more storms, more long nights, and more days when they'd have only each other for company. But for the first time since they'd arrived, Jake wasn't worried about how they'd handle whatever came next. They'd proven they could weather the storms together. Everything else would just be details. Spring came to Copper Ridge like a shy woman, hesitant at first, but growing bolder with each passing day. By late March, the snow had retreated to the high peaks, leaving behind brown grass that would soon turn green and streams running full and wild with snowmelt. Jake stood in his garden plot, turning over earth that had been frozen solid for 5 months, breathing in air that carried the promise of new growth. Behind him, he could hear Tom's excited chatter as the boy helped Sarah plan their expanded vegetable garden, and Lucy's laughter as she chased the barn cat who'd finally ventured outside after the long winter. It had been 6 months since the mail-order bride had arrived with 2 children in tow, and Jake sometimes had to remind himself that there'd ever been a time when their voices weren't the soundtrack to his days. The winter had been long, but good. After that first blizzard, they'd settled into rhythms that carried them through the coldest months with surprising harmony. Sarah had proven herself to be everything Jake could have hoped for in a wife. Capable, intelligent, and possessed of an inner strength that showed itself in countless small ways. She'd learned to read his moods and give him space when the memories pressed too close, but she'd also learned to draw him back into the family circle when solitude threatened to become isolation. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, stretched their supplies through careful planning, and somehow made their small cabin feel spacious enough for all of them. The children had thrived in ways that still amazed him. Tom had shot up 3 inches and filled out until his clothes from Pennsylvania no longer fit. He'd taken to mountain life like a young wolf, learning to track animals through the snow, to read weather signs, and to handle an axe with the confidence of someone twice his age. Lucy had blossomed from a quiet, watchful child into someone who laughed easily and chattered constantly, especially when she was helping Sarah with cooking or when Jake was teaching her to carve simple shapes from pine scraps. She'd lost the guarded expression that had worried him in those first weeks, and her green eyes now sparkled with curiosity instead of caution. But it was the changes in himself that Jake found most surprising. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 8 years had simply disappeared, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging he'd never expected to feel again. He woke each morning looking forward to the day ahead instead of simply enduring it. "Jake," Tom called from across the garden plot. "Ma says we can plant corn where the big stump used to be, but only if you think the soil's good enough." Jake walked over to examine the area where he'd finally removed an old tree stump that had been in his way for years. The earth looked rich and dark, perfect for Sarah's ambitious plans. "Soil looks fine to me," he said, earning a grin from Tom and a satisfied nod from Sarah. "And can we really build a chicken coop?" Tom pressed. "Ma says fresh eggs would be good, and I could take care of the chickens." Jake had been considering the chicken idea all winter. It would mean another trip to McLeod's trading post to buy laying hens, but Sarah was right about the benefits of fresh eggs, and Tom had proven himself responsible enough to handle the care of farm animals. "We'll see about getting some hens when we go to town next week," Jake decided. Tom hooped with excitement, and even Lucy looked pleased at the prospect of baby chicks. The trip to Cedar Falls had been planned for several reasons. They needed supplies for spring planting. Jake wanted to check on any mail that might have accumulated over the winter, and Sarah had mentioned wanting to see how the other families in the valley had fared during the long, cold months. But privately, Jake had another reason for the journey. In his coat pocket was a letter he'd written to the circuit preacher, asking when a man might next pass through their area. It was time to make their arrangement official, to give Sarah and the children the legal protection of his name, and to publicly claim them as his family. He hadn't mentioned the letter to Sarah yet, unsure how she'd react to his assumption that they'd want to make their marriage real in the eyes of both law and God. Their relationship had grown deeper over the winter months, built on respect and affection and shared purpose, but they'd never spoken directly about their feelings for each other. "Jake!" Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find her standing beside him, dirt smudged on her cheek, and her brown hair escaping from its pins. 6 months of mountain life had put color in her face and confidence in her bearing. She looked like a woman who belonged here, who'd found her place in the world. "Yes. Are you all right?" You seemed far away for a moment. Just thinking about our trip to town, he said honestly. It's been a while since we've seen other people. Sarah nodded, understanding. The children are excited. Tom's been asking every day if it's time to go yet. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Tom show Lucy how to identify different types of seeds while the spring breeze carried the scent of pine and snow melt down from the mountains. Sarah, Jake said impulsively, are you happy here? The question seemed to surprise her. She turned to look at him fully, her green eyes serious. Yes, she said simply. I am. Are you? Happier than I've been in years, Jake admitted. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a softness that made her look younger despite the practical work clothes and the smudged dirt. I'm glad, she said quietly. For all of us. The trip to town 2 days later was a celebration of sorts, though Jake was the only one who knew it. Sarah had dressed the children in their good clothes and worn her blue traveling dress, the same one she'd arrived in 6 months earlier. But now she moved with the confidence of a woman who belonged somewhere, who had people depending on her, and work that mattered. Cedar Falls looked much the same as it had in autumn, though the streets were muddy with snow melt, and everyone they met seemed eager to catch up on winter news. At Patterson's general store, Ned greeted them like OL.